Hello, folks. This is the next to last lecture, although it is the last required set of readings. We're trying to wrap up a number of the threads that have been at work in the class over the whole semester, and we're doing it in a way that may surprise some people because this is a class on engineering and technology as the subject of ethics. We are ending up talking about the Amish, who are a minority Orthodox community in the United States, derived from a religious movement in Germany and the Low Countries in the 1800s. They are famous for their reluctance to use technology. And what we're asking today, what we're considering, is whether that reluctance is actually a disagreement with technology or a realistic way of thinking about it and wondering what the questions we should be asking about technology are. And I hope that you'll all be open-minded about it.
Okay, so here's the thing. I have to assume that you've all done the reading, you did the lecture. We spent last week working on the idea that you could identify and recognize how individual or specific ethical theories worked. Pardon me. The thing is that this week what we're doing is looking at how individual theories, complex theories, multiple theories within a culture, within a group, how they fit together, how they interact, and whether or not we can manage those differences. So ethics is particularly important for us in looking at technology and engineering, as I said last week, because it has an extended effect. If I slap somebody, it happens once. The act is localized. If I build a technology that harms somebody, it may continue to harm people for 100 years, 1,000 years. It can be replicated in millions of copies. And so the extending effect matters. And that's a reason to take technological decision making particularly seriously. That's the focus of our approach to ethics in this class. And our theories of ethics as individuals, the way that we as people respond to the world, need to take into account, to worry about, to sort out factors, measures, aspects, details, data, information. And we need to do that to determine right action because we want to know that what we're doing is the right thing. Nobody wants to be hurting people unnecessarily. Nobody wants to be making mistakes. And so the study of the way that ethics work, how right and wrong works, how these things function, that allows us to make those decisions better. So please consider trying to review that material if you don't have a handle on it, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so a minute ago I was talking on the previous slide about the importance of ethics around issues of technology. And as we move into the discussion of the Amish, of how different groups approach and perceive technology differently, I want to just remind you of our definition of technology. And one of the central factors that the study of technologies has shown in philosophical and historical approaches, but particularly in the social science approaches where we use scientific method to understand technology, is that we often have a tendency to assume the naturalness of technology, that progress made it happen, there's nothing we can do about it, and that that's not accurate. That's a logical fallacy. All technologies are made by people, and it is, believe it or not, a choice whether those technology exist, whether they're widespread, whether they're rare, how to govern or manage them. And that's particularly hard for us to see because we tend to think of what we can manage or do as individuals. And in looking at technology policy, one of the things that I want us to think about in this case study, in this set of talk this week, is the question of working together, sharing our ability, and that every society, every large group is making those decisions about what technology to do. Okay, so I mentioned this last week, and I want to really focus on it for about 2 minutes now. And that is, nobody in this room, nobody in the class, nobody in the world is just a utilitarian. And nobody in the world and nobody in the class is just a deontologist. And nobody in the world, nobody in the class is just reliant on a religious ethic. And nobody here is likely to be a sociopath who relies entirely on their own personal internal voice. The reality is that throughout society, there are many groups. Throughout all those groups, there are many different perspectives on moral issues, including what systems of ethics and what determinations of right and wrong should be. And in the picture below, that's a picture of a violent fight, which included guns and swords within Congress a while ago. I know you can tell because it's got the top hats, but around whether or not a subject was appropriate for legislation. And it's not really important. It's a predecessor of the fight over disenfranchisement and enslavement of human beings that centered the fight that led to the Civil War in the United States. But it's just meant to represent that even within a formal structural decision-making body, like a Congress or a parliament, things can become big fights. And those debates, those issues, may be bigger and more likely to be violent outside of us. But the psychologist Gregory Bateson referred to something called a double bind. That is, you're in a bind, you're in a fix. And the double bind is when you have two contrasting or oppositional demands on you, right? So for instance, I have to spend all of my time being productive. I have to make my time worth something, but I also have been taught that I have to then spend my time being fun. I should enjoy it and I should have fun. I can't have too much fun. But what about having family and all these other demands? So now I have a demand to spend my time one way and a demand to spend my time another way. And how do I make those two things? And he argued that the product of a double bind is a form of cognitive or psychological tension. And in other places in psychology, we talk about this as, for example, a stress indices or a stress producing situation. But what I want you to think about is that in ethics, we're actually able to recognize these kinds of counter demands or double binds. And we're in the same way you would in a psychology class in different tools, we're able to begin thinking about it. And so before we move into the really new stuff this lecture, I want to just take a minute to think about that internal ethical framework. Everybody is constantly entering into new situations, new contexts with new information. But what we're bringing into those new situations, whether they're things about the future, whether they're current endeavors, is those internal aspects, and they're linked together. It's not entirely separate, right? There's no absolute boundary between your religious or entrained beliefs, what we might say is dogma, how those things are taught. And there's no real, in terms of the way your actual brain works, difference between that and past experiences, normative ideological expectations. That is, everybody knows you shouldn't be homeless, right? That's a lesson you were learned because of the way society structures itself. We have references and stories and information and moral lessons that are collected over a lifetime. And it doesn't matter if you're 10 years old or 20 years old or 100 years old. All of that is a lot. And what you get out of all that stuff are systems of personal ethics, that is, beliefs about the world. And some of those are rules and some of those are general ideas. But then you also have more specific established systems of ethics, right? You take on a voluntary ethic in the form of you become a student. You take on a voluntary system of ethics that have duties and demands as part of them by becoming part of a profession. You take on those things by becoming part of a fraternity. This is giving you a new set of rules and theories about what right and wrong action are. And in around that, we all have to live in a society. Some people have to live in a complex, multiple society. You have to live knowing your parents are in another country with different rules, and you live in New York or New Jersey with one set of rules, but then you'll spend your summer someplace else with a different set of social and cultural rules, and you have to balance those things with the actual laws, the civil or legal requirements. So part of, or in the best case scenario, what an ethical framework does is it serves as a priority system and allows us to manage those connections. Now, today in the lecture upcoming, I'll focus on the particular function of recognizing accepted ethics as being front and center. So when you take on that new job, or you take on that new role, or you take on that new position, or whatever it is, that's going to be a front and center organizing principle. And we're going to talk about that. So let's see where it goes. Hi. So we're talking today about a variety of things, including how codes of ethics and ethical rules work. And what we want to talk about this week isn't quite as broad as the general introduction to ethical theory last week, because in reality, in a class on engineering ethics and in any professional ethics, there's a specific subset or category of ideas that we need to focus on. And central to that focus is why they're different than personal ethics. In the previous slide, I talked about the difficulty and the complexity of all sorts of kinds of ethical ideas bouncing around in your head, but here's the basic distinction. When you go about talking about ethics, there's a question of what the root or source, why you do the ethical thing, why you're doing ethics in the first place. And the answer is it's variable. But the basic premise of a profession, and in fact, literally the difference between something called a profession traditionally or historically and any job, any vocation, any occupation, any task you might do, is that a profession is defined by the participant having to promise to follow ethical rules. That is, they profess, they claim a certain ethical standing that is separate from those who are not a member of that ethical group. And you could think about this in terms of doctors. They swear to save lives. Or soldiers. They swear to defend the country and the Constitution. You can think of it in terms of lawyers. They swear not to break the law and to uphold and participate in court in a certain way. And you can also think of it as religious figures, a priest, an imam, somebody else. They take on a specific role, and part of taking on that role is separating themselves from the normal expectations of behavior in whatever variety of ways. And when we talk about that kind of change, what we're talking about is an accepted ethic or an admitted ethic. You are let into a special group by having participated in that group's acceptance of the ethic. And all formal professions maintain and include this kind of differentiation. A profession is traditionally defined as a group that takes on a specific responsibility that is an ethical and or legal responsibility. And in exchange, others are prevented from doing some parts of the tasks associated with that profession. In general, that's what's called a monopoly right or a specialty interest. And we do that not because we just want to give a reward to those people, but because society at large, that large group of people who are interdependent, they care and need each other to some degree, have recognized that if you just let anybody do something,
that produces bad outcomes. But the nature of it is complicated because over time, the actual expectations of those professions, what the ethical body or the rules inside that profession will be, do change. So it does get complicated, but we still recognize a difference between an accepted or an admitted ethics and a personal ethic. And at the basis of that distinction, that separation, is one fundamental thing. No matter what ethic you have in your personal ethical system, no matter what religion, no matter which Kantian or Hegelian ethics, no matter what philosophy, no matter consequentialist or deontological, if there is a basis, it will almost always have some form of rule requiring you to fulfill your promise. And one of the things that makes accepted ethics special is that they are generally supported by those other ethics. You have 10 ethics in your head: your religious ethics, your cultural ethic, even legal ethic, all of which, separate from the professional ethic or the accepted ethic, separate from that, also say once you promise to do something, that's an important step. So when you take on an accepted ethic, it is a way of recognizing a priority over others. So traditionally, personal ethics, such as religious ethics, come secondary to a professional ethic. A doctor does not say, well, I don't like that because I have this religious belief, or I don't like that because I have this personal belief, or I still have to live up to my professional qualification ethic. And same thing with an engineer. You can't say, well, I just don't want to do that, or I don't want to do it the right way because my personal ethics is this, because you've agreed to do it the right way. And the moment you stop doing it the right way, you literally are no longer of that profession legitimately. And part of the reason that we talk about this aspect of professional ethics at this point is because it's time, right? We're talking about ethics very generally, and I want you to see that professional ethics, particularly engineering or medical ethics or something like that, are a slightly specific and different thing than ethics in general. And now that we're talking about it, it makes it useful to think about what makes the Amish different from other groups. Because among other things, nobody is automatically Amish. The Amish, to some extent, we can say that they are an ethnicity. It's your ancestry. It's something about your language choices. But to be an actual member of the Amish, you have to accept the ethical rules. And if you don't accept them, you're not a member. It is an accepted ethic. Okay, so in the last slide, I mentioned that the Amish society, their cultural group, forms around an accepted ethic, that you might be the children of Amish people, but until you actually take on that ethical system, that role of ethics defines their community. And the Amish are a complicated thing, but in that sense, I want you to really understand that they are more like a specific profession than they are like, for example, being an American citizen, part of the general culture. There's very little within the spectrum of moral and ethical belief that you have to hold on to be considered an American, right? You could disagree with almost everything everybody else believes, and you'd still be considered American because we allow, within the definition of an American, that variation. Whereas for the Amish, the dutiful following of a specific code of ethics is part of what creates or allows their society, that subculture component within the American community, to be a thing. And if they didn't have that accepted ethic, if they allowed people to make their individual choices, their argument is that they could not be the same kind of thing that they are. So for the Amish, we see a group who say, look, you're turning 18, you're turning 17, however old it is for that specific community of Amish. You have seen what it would mean to live in this community. And if you are willing to follow those rules, if you're willing to participate under that level of commitment, that's great. That's what we want. But now go out into the dominant society in a tradition called Rumspringa. Go see how other people do things so you can make a choice, that there is consent to participate in this in the way that we must ask you to do it. And in general, that means that people understand why and how those ethics work when they come back into it. And it's actually a failing in many cases of professional ethics that students don't get asked to really think about what they're signing up for. In the United States, we went from having a culture in which anybody could do whatever they wanted in terms of building things, and there was no formal system to require you to be making a good product, to a system that said anytime you make a mistake, you're responsible for it, but there's no set profession. Anybody who wants to make something can do it. And that produced a lot of bad products. A lot of buildings fell down, a lot of bridges fell down, a lot of terrible decisions that in some cases benefited some people and not others, and in some cases benefited nobody. And as a society in the United States and in a number of other countries, we recognize the need to hold engineers, architects, and designers to a higher standard than you would, for example, somebody selling paper clips that you just bent into shape to make a little, necklace. Because the artistic or craft product of certain things at a small scale didn't have the extended or enlarged effect of large-scale technological production. And in so doing, what we were doing is very much like the Amish, saying, are there things we need to take seriously in terms of the ethics of technology, of how the world works, of how the machinery and infrastructure and architecture of our world work in order to allow our society to be functional. And we waited really until the beginning of the 40s and 50s to force engineering and other related fields to really follow a professional system. Prior to that, basically anybody could say they were. Even as late as the 1960s, most engineering didn't require a licensed engineer. In general, we've increased the demand for oversight by licensed engineers as the public has been made more and more aware of the kinds of horrible things that technology can do. Right? You have a drug company release a drug, they didn't test it well enough. Well, now we need to have somebody who's actually going to be careful monitoring drug tests. So we need to develop double-blind studies. We need an FDA. We need these things to do it because drugs were very likely to hurt people. And that was one of the earliest forms. We have buildings that increasingly get taller and taller, and they start falling down or not lasting very well. We have bridges spanning longer and longer distances. And increasingly, we need to trust the makers and designers more. So we introduce those professions to balance and respond to the needs of the public at large. And in those codes of ethics that define those fields, there's almost always a recognition of that public trust at the beginning. So, for example, the canon that we'll talk about in a few slides, the key idea of the National Professional Engineering Association in the United States, their primary thing is to protect the safety, welfare, and ability to live of other people, right? That's the responsibility of every engineer. Before you make a product you're proud of, before you worry about your profit margin, before you worry about your next promotion, you have to worry about the safety and welfare of people in the society. And we don't always live up to that. And we don't always hold engineers to that when they screw up. But that's the goal. And the reason you have a profession is because we want somebody to be trustworthy if they're going to be making something that our lives depend on. Similarly, the Amish look at the society around them, the complexity in the world, and they say, you know, let's not do it that way. Let's see if we can build a society that produces the kind of life that we think is morally, religiously acceptable. And we'll be attentive, we'll be intentional, we'll be reflexive about that. And over time, we'll have to change. New technologies will be allowed. But at its core, they don't want to lose track of that central ethical theory. In their case, that their community matters more than an individual. When possible, everybody should benefit. And so their ethical system is based in similar way to John Stuart Mill's suggested all ethical systems should be in his version of utilitarianism, social utilitarianism. But the Amish agree that they're with this basic idea of social cohesion. That is, everybody needs to recognize that there is a real need, right? Not just as an abstract thing, but it is part of what gives us good outcomes. We have to see each other as part of the same community. And the Amish didn't think they could maintain that if they were part of the same community as everybody in the world. So they separated and they said, this is our community and we're going to be great for them and we're going to try not to hurt other people, but there'll be a different standard. So the Amish represent a specific kind of ethical community that is interesting because of its contrast with the dominant American population, dominant American ethics. It's an interesting contrast and an interesting comparison for a profession.
In the Reingold article that was the required reading, I like his sense, his idea that one of the possibilities, one of the ways of reading the Amish is that they're not anti-technology. What they are is applying a sophisticated technological governance. And what that really means is the way that they make decisions, the way that they determine things about technology is an intentional and reflexive prospect. That is, that instead of assuming technology's nature or assuming a general rule, they apply a deliberative, transparent, and reflexive selection process. And we've talked a number of times throughout the semester about the specific value within a system of decision making of each of those things, right? We talked about democracy as a deliberative system, that is, by making the participants actually ask and talk about what decision is to be made. We talked about transparency, that when provided with a structure to make decisions and provided with the information to make the decision, the availability, the openness and access to the information and process that we call transparency allows for better decision making. And in particular, better reflexive decision making. So decision making where we are in specific focused on making the decision the right way, where the process and steps of decision making are as we want them to be. So in that sense, the intentional decision of how and what technologies are to be used in our society is subject to ethical decision making. And I know that it's unrealistic in our larger society to think of adopting a piece by piece, deliberative, transparent, reflexive decision making technique. But what I want us to think about is whether or not there are lessons to be learned here, both as engineers and as members of a society, about what the role of technology is. And we'll talk more about those general senses in a minute, but the question that the Amish teach us or ask us to think about, the question that's been at the core of one level or another of every reading this semester is, what does society need? What does it need to fix, right? Rather than throwing untested technologies at deficiencies or issues, what goals can we decide are worth having, right? In the first week's reading, we talked about the Matheson Gray article's concept that in aggregate, over time, Lots of little technologies have very large and radical effects. We talked about the difficulty in noticing and perceiving the details of the innate effects, the innate politics, the ongoing functions and ways that technologies have of changing what options are enabled and constrained. The case studies we've looked at how increasing complexities of technology make these decisions, make these evaluations harder. Right, so what we've talked about all semester is how to operationalize and consider reflexive and intentional decision making, and I've attempted to, more often than not, leave blank which system of values, which system of ethics you should use, with the basic ethic of the class being that in order to be ethical, you have to actually apply ethics. And that means being reflexive and intentional. If you believe that whatever rule, whatever system of ethics is worth applying, is worth making your ethics, and you can apply it well, you are more ethical than somebody who doesn't apply ethics. And one of the things about that is that that's just the nature of ethics. Ethics is the attempt to understand and produce right actions. So what does the way we make our decisions say about us? And in this case, we're talking in aggregate as a society. What and who do those technologies benefit? And we're going to use this case example of the Amish to talk about that. Unlike our society, which does not have a general consensus on what the goals of technology are in an explicit, transparent way, the Amish use a concept that is introduced in the Rheingold article called an Ordnung. And the Ordnung is not only about technology. It's the set of rules that define what a desirable life is for individuals and society. Rules such as the importance of sharing in community operations, in helping each other. In their case, their Ordnung relies on and directs towards Christian practices. But the general argument that is made is that any society has those rules. And part of the significant difference between our society at large and the minority society formed with the Amish is that the Amish talk about and debate and consider the Ordnung. They make those rules transparent, deliberated, and reflexive. And I actually like the discussion from another article. A guy named Crump wrote for Medium.com. He asked, what are the Amish capable of teaching us about technology? And he also, like Rheingold, cites this idea that there is an explicit set of rules, a set of goals for technology within their Ordnung. The idea that the Ordnung are the rules that define and support a way of life that is desirable. And a number of times throughout the semester, I've said, we actually have designed our society to do X, or we have done this, or in some cases, I've argued with students about things like what the meaning of democracy is, because it is often the case that we're building a society through the complex interaction of social institutions and technologies that may not serve the end goals that we originally intended. The rules within the Ordnung, though, within the Amish society, are centered around and explicitly structured by a certain set of values. And I like the summary that Crump uses. He says the Ordnung is built to produce and to preserve their community, their culture, their identity, and their faith. And it explicitly says what those things are. For instance, it says that interaction and recognition that they're different from the larger society is useful to those things. It allows you to recognize who members of your community are and what your cultural identity is. And the nature of being outside the larger society is not valuable simply for being outside. It is functional in a specific and recognizable way. And over time, as their way of life required greater or lesser interaction with the outside world, they're willing to protect their family system and their culture by doing that. If, for instance, they need more money because tax laws apply to them, they are willing to open up some rules of interaction for work because those openness become the techniques that produce the outcome they're looking for. It's an explicitly consequentialist system. A rule is not important because it's a rule, except for the guiding deontological principles that they derive from religious faith. So the system is, I said a long time ago that in the real world, all ethical systems are actually hybrids. They're a combination of deontological foundational principles and methods of evaluation which are often consequentialist. And this is a good example of that, right? So the Amish don't believe technology is evil in and of itself. In fact, they make use of many technologies: batteries, electric lights, farm equipment, landline telephones, although they use these things with very specific rules about their use because the effects and politics of the technology have been evaluated. And Reingold talks about this. Crump talks about this. Everybody who writes about technology use by the Amish are always surprised and really interested in the fact that these technological decisions, they're not knee-jerk. So a new technology's arrival, it is not automatically banned. They require a period of time to evaluate both the positive and negative functions within the maintenance of those things that the Ordnung wants to keep going, wants to protect. What concerns the Amish about technology is that unchecked or used improperly, technology can negatively impact, even destroy the things they hold most dear. At the center of that is the idea of family and a quality and kind of life that allows for meaningful behavior and action at an individual level within that family. So if, for instance, the acceptance of cell phones is necessary to connect people because the realities materially and economically mean that people live farther and farther apart or are necessary for businesses, then there can be a new rule that says, for instance, cell phones are acceptable, but you can't use them in the house. And that's the example that both the Crump article and the Reingold article are particularly interested in, right? They discourage the use of the internet because, for instance, the way that we get information, if it's too easy, it ceases to be evaluated. If we change how we act, we should have a reason for doing it. You don't speed up a process simply to speed it up. But where a process has presented a challenge or difficulty to community or to family or to other important things that are determined to be important by your family and your community, then you do change the rules. You do change which technologies it is. So, for instance, many groups of Amish, while they do not accept the use of cars and personal travel devices like that are very fast, they did realize that as communities connected over larger distances, they needed ways to travel. And they do say that, for instance, many, not all, do say that people are allowed to take buses or trains. But by limiting to those systems, they mean that you, A, don't have to pay for a car, you don't have the impulse to use the car more often, and the system of decision-making remains about the nature of the technology. You continue to evaluate and consider its effects. Whereas if you accept cars, you then accept that people will use and drive cars often. Making it a tentative or an occasional thing means that you are asking the person to be reflexive about each journey as opposed to deciding that all journeys are okay. And I think one of the reasons that cell phones are so noteworthy is because it took a very long time for landline telephones to be accepted. And there were very specific reasons how the world was changing, how communities were being challenged to stay in connection to each other, and the speed of life and economic connections, all of which meant that over time, some degree of community protection was provided by those phones. Um, and there's been a lot of conflict in the Amish community about cell phones because theoretically, most of the kinds of things that are useful to their system of values about cell phones can already be done with landlines. And that means that it's a much more challenging um, technology to argue in favor of. But it's one that is extremely convenient, and it does provide some differences in function, so that the community is torn on this one. And in other cases, such as the use of the electrical system, that sort of consideration was never challengeable. It was never a question. In order to use the electric grid, you had to go online and connect to the larger community. It was another way of demanding longer hours of work, of changing who and what your community was, making it less recognizable to members, and making it easier and in some ways more desirable to have members of your community extend outside of it. Therefore, they specifically chose, after a number of years of evaluation, that they wouldn't use the electrical grid. And they actually have reverted and or revisited the decision about electricity a number of times. After a certain point in time, as it became clear that power tools and other devices for labor um, were useful in a way that would allow more family time, that would allow better quality of life for everybody in the community, it was determined that, for instance, batteries and pneumatic devices that did not require an ongoing connection to the larger society could be used. And there's a very fine threshold there because, for instance, they do not manufacture their own batteries. They require an outside source. But that each of these decisions, as complex as it is, can still be determined and added to and revisited and responded to in this set of rules in the ordinum. So one of the questions that's implicit in the Rheingold article is that there would be a recognizable Ordnung in the American dominant society, in our culture, and that we should be asking what our Ordnung is, right? If Ordnung is the detailed body of rules that we use to direct the way one lives, then we should be able to recognize that. Critiques that come from the way that we do all sorts of things arise all the time. We consider, why is it everybody is under such stress? Why is it that we have to think about work so much? Why is it that we value money over art? What is the system of values? And that is a more complicated question in a society that has pluralism, where we consider the variation of people's values, but it isn't impossible to do. So we can look for the commonalities and the variety of things that we've talked about over time, the way that the politics of artifacts considers all of these items. And what the code in our society is something that we can't solve and we can't figure out in one class, but it's something that you as engineers, because you will be building that potential future, whether it's an aspirational one guided by a view of the future in ethics, whether it's materially simply building new technologies, what are you trying to do? What is the goal? And if you're unreflexively and uncritically saying, well, I just want to improve efficiency, or if you're relying on the myth of the neutrality and benevolence of technology, I hope that you'll take an opportunity to stop and ask yourself whether those things really work. The nature of technology is always going to be more complex than that, and each variety and form of technology has many effects. Who is it that is asking those questions? Because in theory, it should be the engineers, it should be the designers. Reingold echoes the readings from this semester. He suggests that we're all always having a conversation with our tools, that they're enacting, that they're enabling, constraining, and being reinforcing of politics and governing mentalities all the time. And as you are enmeshed with your technology in your life, we should be asking a question of what kind of life those technologies are producing. Not that they're individually bad, but that they're individually questionable. We can have a conversation with our tools and ask which forms of life they are producing. In previous semesters, I've often given the Granville and Gilbertson article as a required reading along with the Reingold article. Granville and Gilbertson are providing another take on the same thing, but that the basic premise in this fight over cell phones also comes back to one of our discussions of Lessing. That the nature of the cell phone as it's now existing and the nature of it as an internet device means that there is no way to accept or consider cell phones without the system of individualist freedom values that are probably desirable to you, but that are directly at odds with communal societal systems of values like the Amish. And that one of the things that they remark on in the Granville and Gilbertson article is that despite hugely similarities of the way that the Amish go about things and consider things to the people in the dominant culture, there are very specific differences. And they note that despite a very entrepreneurial, very capitalistic tendency, it's all the more remarkable that those systems and opportunities and values are contrary to internet culture, contrary to much in the dominant culture. They're channeled and thought about through a culture of what Gilbertson and Granville describe as a culture of restraint, right? That the Amish draw a bright, sharp line between what is allowed at work, smartphones, internet access, and what's forbidden at home. And that each of them individually, because they can recognize and understand the reason for those differences, accepts and embraces those restraints as making life better. And the Amish consider a good and reliable limitation to be part of making sense of the world.
All right, so I compared earlier the Amish system, a community of people who share an ethical code that's definitive. It defines who they are to the way professions work. And in general, I think that that's a useful way to think about it. Depending on what ethical system, what rules you follow, what kind of stuff you do, that is even more than any technical expertise, knowing calculus, knowing material structures. That is how we define an engineer, right? You might be a good technician or a good mathematician, but there's a difference between that and the engineer. The engineer has committed to determining and being able to predict the outcomes to meet plan and purpose in a desirable way. And in class this week, we'll probably talk a little bit more about this, and then we'll keep coming back to it. As an example, the National Society for Professional Engineering, NPSE, is one of the main organizations for engineers in the U.S., and they're one of the older and stronger engineering organizations generally. For them, they argue that the engineering profession is centralized on a whole lot of things, but one of the key elements is the self-policing, that engineers are watching out whether other engineers are doing it the right way because they are the ones qualified and obligated as a duty of the profession to monitor and correct other engineers. And the reason that they have that duty is because engineers are allowed and directed to be what they are because of the compliance, the ethical nature of the work that they do. So in the NPSC code, which I'll bring to class and we'll share around and talk about a bit on Monday or Tuesday in class, the NPSC code starts with the preamble. They say before you even get into the complexities, before there's anything else, the preamble says engineering is an important and learned profession. As members of the profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, the services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, equity, and must be dedicated to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. Right? That's their statement that before you get into the details, that's what we're shooting for. And over time, part of the thing to know is that the details may change, right? The context change, the technology change, the landscape, the legal or policy issues may change, but that preamble doesn't. Because people rely on it for the quality of life and for their living, it is the obligation or the duty of every engineer to be concerned about fairness and equity to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And in the discussion of ethics in that thing, it starts with canons. That's literally the things that are highest, the most important. But they're not just the highest and most important. Canons are there to define, to tell us how to interpret other things. And the first canon is engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And that's that public trust. That is what engineers are trusted to do. And a lot is said there because it doesn't say you have to be a nice person. It doesn't say you have to be a good family man or a good family woman. It doesn't say that you have to be a decent human being outside of your professional activities. But within your professional duties, and later in the NPSC, it does more to try and define what those duties are. Within those public duties, you have to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That's not to say it just has to be healthy for one person, but that part of what you're obligated to do is consider the broad and extended effects. And this is one of the places where we come back to the discussion in Mathis and Gray that there is something very important about that long-term view, the aggregate effects, those levels of prediction in complexity that are so terrifyingly difficult sounding to you guys. But that is what an ethical engineer is obligated to do. Every profession has a code of ethics. And in fact, in a few weeks, we'll be talking about a variety of them and comparing medical and engineering ethics. But for today, understand that in the same way you all, as students, technically signed on, agreed to a code of ethics as students, there is a recognizable system of ethics that defines and comes along with being an engineer. All right. Now, before we end the lecture, what I'm asking everybody to do, what I'm asking you to think about, not just in terms of what's involved in the professional ethics of engineering, but at the beginning of this lecture, I said everybody has this complex set of ethics in their head. Everybody has a hybrid. Everybody has a little, consequentialism, a little bit of deontology, a concern about some duties and maybe not other. And all of that's floating around. And one of the things that I encourage everybody to do is it's often overly complex. It's often invisible to you. And in the beginning of the semester, I keep harping on about reflexivity and intentionality. In order to be ethical, you have to know what's going on. You have to actually be making an intentional choice. You have to actually try to do the decision making the right way. And the reason for that is that as you do that, you will be more and more aware, more and more attentive to why you're doing things, what the ethics are. Is it the right thing? And in order to do that, what I'm asking or suggesting everybody do in general, and I'm not collecting it now, is take some time as you work through these ideas, as you work through the semester, but sooner write down what those ethical rules, those mechanisms, those frameworks, try to diagram what those ideas in your head are. Which ones are most important to you, right? Which ones do you think direct you in useful ways, and which ones do you forget about a lot? Are there priorities? Are there key rules to say this is the kind of action, the kind of work, the kind of person you want to be? I'm not sure that I want to suggest that you can control all of that, but you can control a little bit better how you determine those things, how you act, what your actions are, whether those decisions live up to your ethics, if you've actually been thoughtful, reflexive about what's actually in there. Make a list of canons so that you know what your personal Ordnung is. The most important assumptions, the axioms, the key ethics for you, right? I'm not going to collect it right now. I'm asking you to do it as an exercise in reflexivity. At the end of the semester, I do ask you to write them up. I ask you to write them up, and I ask you to bring them to class, and we'll talk about them again. Now, I know that for most of you, this weird German word, the Ordnung, the ordering, it doesn't make a lot of sense as the word. But you could think about it as your contract with yourself or just your ethical framework. But for the assignment, I'm going to refer to it as you defining your Ordnung.
In general, in this class, I try to focus us on ethics and not on values. Values being beliefs about what is important, good, or valuable that we're taught as we grow up. And the complex issue there is that, especially around technology, we can't have a conversation about technology without dealing with a whole lot of ideas about the value and the importance of technology that we're taught. At a basic level, Western society, especially in the United States, but all of modern Western society, comes about through a conversation between what's called humanistic and instrumental values. Instrumental values are things that originally were important because they allowed you to get somewhere. Right? Efficiency is important because what is produced efficiently is important, not because efficiency is important. It is instrumental. It is a way to do. And by contrast, historically, Western society, and this is pretty broadly speaking, has shared a sense of a number of different values: peace, love, harmony, charity, kindness, all sorts of things that were seen as human and innately valuable on their own. Instrumental values, including efficiency, functional hard work, and things like that, effort, were not individual values. They were not universal values. They were not humanistic values. Those were instrumental values. And one of the things that happens is, as we start to have a love affair with technology, we start to forget those humanistic values, and we see the instrumental values as valuable on their own, in their own case, for their own sake. And it's not to say that that's a terrible thing, but when we're doing ethical evaluation, we have to be clear about which of those values we're talking about. When you talk about something being of good, especially if you're talking about a consequence or an effect, the good that is produced has to be understood, why it is good, what's good about it. So if you say something like it's innovation, then you can't just be saying it's new. It has to be new and better for a reason. The word innovation isn't about replacing what is old unless your argument is that simply being newer is fundamentally of value. And when we're talking about that sort of thing, if we're talking about something being a value, a good, an ethical good especially, we should know what it's producing, what it is, why it is a good, what is beneficial about it. At the center of the slide is this idea from psychology of Maslow's motivational model or hierarchical needs that some things produce or demand our attention. And it's interesting because a lot of the time we sort of get muddled up in what need something is fulfilling. And the reality is that much of the time, if we're busy, if we're working hard, we can forget the most important values, the most important benefits, because we have to focus on other kinds. Certain things have to come first. You have to get paid so you can get fed, and that means that's the most important thing, but it doesn't have to be. And so in the background of our discussion of ethics, we need to keep which values, goals, or benefits are the ones we're going to value and think about in our mind.
Hey, gang. So if you got to the end of the lecture, this is it. This is the last slide. I'm sticking this in right here, and I'm curious to see if anybody notices it. I don't think everybody's actually doing the lectures. I don't think we're getting it. I'm worried that we're going to have to go back to doing in-class lectures. We can do that. But what I'm going to ask is, before you disappear, before you end the lecture, listen to me once. This week, I'll pass around an attendance sheet as usual, but on Wednesday, Thursday, when we're in class, we're going to be doing our in-class exercise. I'm going to pass my attendance sheet out, and everybody in groups will put their names down as usual. But on the attendance sheet, right, just the attendance sheet for just the day on Wednesday or Thursday, second class of the week, please put down a silly name, a fictional character, something that's ridiculous. Do not put your real name. I'm not going to use that attendance sheet for attendance. I'm using it just as a test to see how many people actually listen to the whole lecture. And I'd appreciate it. Try not to be too offensive with your names, but whatever you want to write, that's all. I'm just curious to see who will do this. Okay, last minute to think about this, and then you can go back to your lives. And I want you to see, this is just a meme thing, but it's a real thing. I looked up the company. The numbers aren't exact, but look, we're creating a world that we live in, that you're making a choice to participate in, sort of have a choice, sort of don't. And my last thought for you about the Amish is, as strange as they sound, picture being able to live the kind of life that they have. Now, they don't have internet very much. They don't have as many movies, but they have tight-knit families who support each other and participate in a lot of actually quite fun activities as well as hard work. And the opposite of that, the thing that you're saying you want to be moving towards, instead of that, is a life like this one in this meme. And the meme is a picture of a guy. He's in his 20s. He's sitting by a bunk bed. And the meme is a statement from the person, right? It's Stephen T. Johnson, 27, works in social media advertising and lives in Hollywood. He spends most of his day using the things he does not own. Right? He takes a rideshare service to get to the gym. He does not own a car. At the gym, he rents a locker. He uses the gym's laundry service because he does not own a washing machine. Johnson doesn't even have an apartment. Actually, he rents a bed in a larger room with other people who rent beds for nights, weeks, months at a time. Through a service called PodShare, you rent just the space in the bed that is like a bunk bed, which gives you a place to store a suitcase and a place to sleep. There's a bathroom there, but he chooses not to use it. Mostly, he uses the bathroom, showering and readying himself at the gym. All the residents have access to a shared kitchen and bathroom. Johnson also rents a desk at a WeWork, a co-working space, and says the only clothes he owns are two versions of the same outfit. Johnson says he owns so little that he has even been able to get rid of his backpack. I gave that up 2 months ago, he says. He says that for him, the lifestyle isn't cumbersome or confusing. That's what great, he says. When you don't own things, you don't have to keep track of them. You just show up. He pays $1,400 a month to rent a bunk and an additional $600 to rent the desk at WeWork. And my question isn't whether that's bad for him, but any time that we're talking about these complex issues, what you have to understand is, as an aggregate, as a whole, we're building a society. And the Amish, they may be slower, but they're building a society where families are together, where people still live in houses, where people are allowed to have more than one suit of clothing, where people's life is not based on rentals. And on the other side, you have a society that's moving more and more towards the model that this meme is talking about, this model where we share rented desk and a single rented apartment bed, and where a gym membership, all of those things require money as opposed to having a place in the world for yourself. Which kind of world are we building towards? Which kind should we be building towards? Which kind does you, in your personal commitments, your ordinals, which one do you want? Which one do you want the aspirational ethic, the future building that we're doing to be building towards?